Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Courtney Portella, and I'm on the marketing team here at Aware Manager. Joining me is my colleague, Anna Silva, who's going to be helping to moderate our questions during the Q&A portion of this. Speaking of questions, if you have any, feel free to put them into the chat panel and just make sure, actually on here it's the Q&A panel, sorry about that, and just make sure they're going to go to all panelists so Anna can see them. If you have any technical issues, feel free to put those into the chat or Q&A, and somebody from Trade Press will get you sorted out. But jumping into today's topic, we wanted to spend some time talking about why facility management software projects are prone to failure and how to prevent them. And this is really geared towards if you're looking to make a change in the software that you're using, if you're looking to buy a new program, or even if you're just thinking about how do you improve the usage of your current system. So we're going to kind of go into the common reasons why it fails and try to go into how to really overcome those failures. So let's dive right in. So the first part we're going to cover and actually spend the most time on today is poor planning and project management. So we've probably all heard the old adage, you know, failing to plan is planning to fail. And this is especially true when you're trying to roll out a new facility management program or you're swapping systems. And while you're searching for that system, or even before you start the search, there are a few things that you should be thinking about and working on to really set you up for success in the long term. The first is thinking about how the software impacts your organization. If you think about the different teams within your organization in facility management software or CMMS, whatever you call it, the obvious answer is that it will impact the facility team, the engineering team, and perhaps property management if you're in a commercial setting. But it can also impact a lot of the other users, and you need to really think about this as you're thinking about how to roll out a new piece of software. For example, it could impact accounting if you're trying to track billable charges or vendor charges. It could impact building security if you would like them to use the new visitor management module that's part of your facility management tool. And it could also impact your vendors. I mean, ideally, we always recommend that vendors should be using your FM software directly so you can see what they're doing in real time, but that means that they really have to be accounted for in the rollout process. It also impacts the end users. And again, end users can mean a couple of different things. If you're in a commercial office building, that's the tenant. If you're in a corporate setting, that could really be every employee at the company, because ideally, the facility management software that you pick will include an online portal where people can put in the work request, and that will ideally eliminate the calls and the emails directly to the facilities team. So to really overcome this and to start out for success, we strongly recommend creating a stakeholder map that outlines each person that the software impacts and how. And from there, you can determine when and how to engage them in the buying process and then also the onboarding process. So this leads us to, what does your project team look like? So you want to make sure that you figure out who's going to be involved in both buying and onboarding from the very beginning. So we wanted to kind of showcase a little bit of what an example project team would look like. So again, this is just an example, and we're going to talk a little bit about an executive sponsorship a little bit further in the presentation. But the thing to keep in mind here is that there are a few key people that should be involved here. You want to make sure that you do have somebody from the executive team who is really driving this and sponsoring the project. The second most important person is really the internal project manager. So who's going to make sure that everything is getting done? And then you also want to have representation from that stakeholder map. So everybody who is going to be impacted by the software should have somebody represented here. So if you're thinking about that, it would be, you would want additional kind of columns here to represent people like accounting, like building security on the right side of engineering, to make sure that you're accounting for everybody. Another really important part of this is to have dedicated system admins, really targeted and understanding who those are going to be. Usually for us, it's somebody who's a facility manager, it could be a chief engineer, it's somebody who's really going to know the ins and outs of the system, and also, you know, how to set it up and really change it as your business needs change, not just kind of use it in the day-to-day. A couple of things to keep in mind is that these are just the roles. It doesn't necessarily represent the people. So for example, your internal project manager may also be your system admin, and that person may also be the facility manager. So that really differs from organization to organization, depending upon how large your organization is, and also just depending upon how you're structured. You also should really think about who is the project team going to be from your solution provider perspective. So as you're vetting technologies, you want to make sure that you have a dedicated account manager. Sometimes now they're called customer success managers. You want to make sure there's going to be someone on the implementation side of the house who is really working with you to make sure your data is in the best shape, to make sure that the software is really being implemented the way you want it to be. And then typically there's a counterpart of a project manager for the software provider as well. Again, the implementation specialist may also be your project manager, but you want to just make sure those are the things that are accounted for. So now that your team is squared away, you want to think about the data. So without accurate and timely data, whatever software you choose is likely to fail because the software is the engine. That's how you really want to think about that analogy. And the data is the gas. That's what's going to get you to where you want to be. But without that data in the right shape, you're going to have a really hard time progressing forward. So there are a lot of aspects about data quality, and here's just some of the things to think about. So you want to think about, does it match the format that you're going to want to import it in? So typically when you're using a new system, they'll import all the data in via Excel. But you're going to need to make sure that the fields map the fields as they're going to be defined in your new software system. A big one is going to be, is the data complete? So for example, if you're thinking about your list of assets or equipment, do you have all of your assets or equipment documented in a digital format? Or do some of them really still live in binders or in boxes? It's not unusual for us to get a box sent to us of data that has to be converted from paper to digital, but you do want to make sure that the data is complete from that perspective. And of course, you want to make sure it's accurate and correct. So that means that, that the warranty dates on those equipments are correct, that the cost is correct, that all of that information is really right from the very beginning, because it's going to be a lot harder if you put bad data in to then go back and correct it before you move forward. So if you're thinking about where we're at now in our process, so we have the people laid out, we have the data, now it's time to actually think about, well, how is this going to work? And you really have to think about that from how is the software going to be rolled out. So this quote is actually on my desktop background. You can do anything, but you can't do everything. And there's some debate in our office as to if that second part of the sentence should read, but you can't do everything well. This is really true when you're rolling out a software program, because odds are that the program will have more features or modules than you really need at day one. So you need to think about what is going to be rolled out first. So for example, you may have an unlimited budget, but you don't have unlimited time or people. And I would bet most people on the line here are not going to have an unlimited budget either. So it's important to pick out 2 to 3 modules first, get them up and running, and then think about what to do next. And we really recommend starting with what we call the life cycle of a work order. So here's a little bit about what that would look like. And again, this is just an example of how you process a work order may look different depending upon your organization. But the real example here is to think about this process because it encompasses several groups of stakeholders, so everybody starts to get engaged from day one, and it's also fairly quick to set up. So it demonstrates a fast value and return on your initial investment in the software. So for example, let's kind of think how this would work. So the first step would be that an end user, your customer, enters a work order in via the portal. So that means that your portal is set up and ready to go, and your end users are trained on how to use it. So that stakeholder checkbox is marked. Next is that the work order is auto-assigned to the engineer based maybe perhaps on the work type, and that engineer is alerted via email or text message, however you want them to be alerted. So that means from a stakeholder perspective that the person actually doing the work is using the system and that they're using mobile. So ideally, if you think through the next step, you really want your engineers to be using mobile in the day-to-day. They shouldn't be walking back and forth to the office to mark things as completed or to add notes. So again, that means another part of the program is up and running. That means your end users are trained on how to use mobile. So let's say they complete the work order on mobile, and now a manager needs to review that to make sure, perhaps the costs are correct, make sure that the work was done in a satisfactory manner. And so the manager then closes out the work order. They could do that on mobile, they could do that on the desktop, but the idea is that then they're also trained on how the product works and what the workflow is. And then lastly, a customer satisfaction is sent out to the person who originally entered the work order. So you're then being able to get the data that's really important to understand if your customer was happy or not. So in this example, you have several parts of your facility management software set up. You have the end user portal, you have mobile set up and running. This means that basic information about how you want to deal with corrective work is set up, and your surveying is set up. So it involves several different types of stakeholders, and it also means that you've had experience with different parts of the tool. So if you're thinking about what that looks like in a project plan perspective, phase 0, I like to phrase it as phase 0 rather than phase 1 because it's not necessarily meaning that the first phase is actually using the system. Phase 0 is actually getting the data right. So importing any existing data that you have, understanding what those workflows for you are going to be. For example, do you really want work orders automatically routed, or do you want a manager to assign them out as they come in? And it will also help you identify what are the project milestones. Phase 1 in this example is what we just talked about, the life cycle of a work order. So again, your portal is ready, your mobile app is ready, and people can do the basic function of completing a work order. The most common phase 2 is preventive maintenance. So making sure that all of your equipment is enrolled, getting your PM schedules aligned, and then training your staff and your vendors on how to complete PMs, how to complete inspections. And that really is kind of the heart of CMMS as it traditionally is defined. From phase 2, you can have whatever kind of comes next for you. So maybe that is visitor management, maybe it's purchase orders, whatever is kind of the next most important thing for your company. So now we're going to move on to the second reason why projects fail. And for this, it's really that you have to think about the technology itself and making sure that you're selecting a software that can grow with you as your needs evolve and as technology changes and improves. So technology, I think we can all probably agree that is transforming a lot faster than our industry is. So here are a few things to keep in mind as you're looking at new systems. So the software, first and foremost, should be configurable to your needs. That means things like statuses and work types and equipment categories should be defined by you. You shouldn't have to conform to a preset configuration. You should be able to add custom fields, and you should be able to define the workflows that you want. For example, when should people be notified of overdue work orders, things like that. That way, as your business needs change, you know that the software has the flexibility to change right along with you. The second thing is really looking for a solution provider that includes all the software upgrades at no extra cost. And that really ensures that you have access to the latest and greatest technology without an exorbitant price increase. And you know, the upgrade strategy is really important because understanding how much a vendor is going to do upgrades shows how much they're innovating and thinking ahead. And upgrades are really a good thing. So you really want to ask during the buying process how often those upgrades happen and how do they execute them. A really important thing also along the lines of the technology is making sure that you're picking an open solution. So if you're thinking about how technology has really changed, before a lot of our clients would look for an all-encompassing solution and they would use only one software for everything. And now the industry has really changed. A lot more people are choosing to have best-in-breed systems that can talk to each other. But to be able to do that, you have to make sure that the systems are open and can integrate with each other. So you want to know that you can do that now, even if you don't have plans at the very beginning to integrate different systems. You just want to know that the functionality exists. And what's really driving that is just the amount of technology companies that are really growing in the real estate industry. So this is one company's estimate of how many there are. So this company estimates around 1,200 companies serving the real estate industry right now. Realcomm, which specializes in commercial real estate, is more aggressive with their estimate. They believe the number is pushing around 2,500. So again, you may not need integration today, but you should just know that the capability exists. So the third reason why projects fail is probably the one that's the most frustrating. So many of you probably already have a facility management software in place, but I bet not all of you are completely thrilled at how it's being used throughout your system. So it's definitely the #1 frustration during implementation, just getting people to use the software. And it happens day one. You may be 3 years down the line and still having trouble getting people to use whatever system you've chosen. The good news is that it's avoidable, and it's usually not the user's fault. It just means that they really either weren't trained on what the software is and what it can do. It wasn't properly explained as to why they need to do this or why it matters for the company or how it helps them. Those are all things that you really control, especially during the initial onboarding process. So we're going to take a look at a few common reasons that cause user adoption issues. So the first one is communication. So we're going to do some before and afters for the next couple of slides. So the way that it is most commonly used is, hey, we're going to tell you that you're changing a software that you use, even if you already love the one that you have, but it doesn't explain how we're going to roll out this change or why the change is happening. So you may mention it once or twice, and then they sit through a couple training sessions, but they don't really understand what's happening. So if you put yourself in a place where, think of one software or even one app on your phone that you really love, and all of a sudden that's being ripped out of your hands, people are going to get upset by that if you don't really understand why it's happening. So here are some of the things that we recommend in terms of a communication plan. The first thing is really involving the team during the buy-in process. So you should have some representation of the actual user on the buying committee. It's pretty rare these days that one person makes the decision for an entire company. So you want to make sure that the team is involved and understands why the system was chosen, what is important to have in the new system, what's their wish list, just so they feel really invested in what's happening. And you also want to explain how the new software is going to make their life better, because at the end of the day, everybody cares about, most importantly, about themselves. So how is this going to help their job get easier? How is it going to help them be more efficient? And why is this happening? Because if you don't know how it's going to help them, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to articulate that for themselves. And the last thing is really understanding who your champions are. So figuring out who is really taking well to change, because change is hard. Not everybody is going to be really jazzed about it. So figuring out who's okay with it and who can act on your behalf to really kind of promote that this is a good thing and not a bad thing. So the next is lackluster training, let's call it. So training is a huge problem for a lot of companies. So training usually looks like 1 or 2 large group sessions. They're usually done in a webinar format similar to this. And then that's it. You've been shown the product once. You're expected to know exactly how to use it. There's no real assessment done to see if it's working. There's no long-term plan laid out, and you're just kind of expected to go on your merry way and use the software. What we recommend is a structured training plan by user type, or sometimes people will call it persona. So for example, your system admin should be trained very differently than the person who is just going to use the portal to enter a work request. Those trainings shouldn't be lumped together. They shouldn't be the same. They should really be very much based on who is actually going to be using the system and how. So for example, that system admin may need to know how to, do things like rejig people's user settings to make the font bigger, or to be able to turn on spell check, or kind of those very foundational things. But an end user may not need that. Even an engineer who's completing work orders on mobile won't need to understand that functionality. And if you waste the time that you have with them teaching that, then that's exactly what it is. It's just wasted time. So you want to make sure that you're training by person, and then you also want to make sure that you're training by how they're going to be using the system. The other thing that's really important is to have a train the trainer approach. So this is really used to, after day 1, even after day 365, have somebody internally who can act as kind of your internal knowledge hub. So you want to have somebody who understands more of the inner workings of the system than somebody else. Usually that's the system admin. And then they can answer the questions that the team has as they go along. And, you really want to make it fun. So just think about how this can really be interactive. And you have to understand that I think a lot of people get really frustrated when they go through a training, and then at the end of an hour-long session, nobody has any questions. You may have to kind of push at people to get them to ask questions, or, if you demonstrate how to, for example, close a work order on mobile and say, hey, does everybody understand how to do that? And everyone kind of stares at you blankly. They may not understand really how to do it. So you may even want to say, hey, somebody come up here and demonstrate how you close out a work order, just to make sure that they're understanding the system as well as they can. The next is thinking about how to incorporate feedback. So usually the problem is that there is no feedback mechanism kind of built into a training or an onboarding structure. So the training is done, your official onboarding with the software program is done, and then we'll call it a day and say the software is fully implemented, but it's probably not working as well as you want it to work. So here's how this should really look. So there should be phase 1 training, again, that maps to whatever phase 1 is for you. So in our example that we went over earlier, that's how to enter a work order and close it out, the life cycle of a work order. So you want to train them on how to do all of those things. You may want to walk through them the first time they're doing it, maybe the second, or the fifth time they're closing out a work order, and really make sure that you're observing how they're using it. So again, people may say that they're fully trained and they understand what you've been kind of preaching at them, but they may not. So during phase 1, you also want to look at how the process works. It may need to be revised. It may not go as perfect as you assumed it to be. So you may need to tweak the process and then retrain the users as needed. Again, you're going to want to do the same thing for each phase in your onboarding. So the last part is really thinking about what does this mean for new users. So it's pretty rare these days that someone is going to stay in a job for 10 or 15 years. So say 6 months after you buy a piece of software and implement it, there's a new hire who is now going to be expected to use that software every day. Is that software now included in the new employee onboarding program? Is that really a part of how you greet them and how you train them to be successful from day 1? And then the other thing that we really encourage is quarterly webinars or quarterly something, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's an interactive session, just something that on a consistent basis, so whether it's every quarter, it could be every 6 months, whatever really works for you, that they're consistently being trained on whether it's a new feature or they are perhaps learning a new way of using the system, or it's just a refresher. You want to make sure that it's not just a one-and-done approach. So the last thing we're going to cover today is the importance of executive support. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this just because the numbers kind of speak for itself. So 75% of projects, according to Capterra, fail because senior management doesn't get involved. So I don't know who that senior manager is for you. It's just important that somebody is really driving this project. They can be the stick or they can be the carrot. So they may be the one motivating people to use it, but 2 years down the line, I mean, at some point, a software that's as critical as a CMMS is really going to be the foundation of your whole department. So being able to say you have to use this software as a condition of your employment really needs to come from the top. So that's why we just want to make sure that we really encourage you all to understand who that executive sponsor is going to be for you. It could be the director of your department. It could be somebody from a different department. It could be IT. It just has to be somebody who is really owning this at the executive level. So to wrap up, just so we can leave some time for questions, I just wanted to kind of go over, here's our kind of quick tips as to what we went over today. So having a very clear strategy for deployment and planning your rollout in phases is very important. Understanding what those quick wins are. So for example, if your implementation is 6 months long, that's probably too long. That means it's 6 months from purchase to seeing real value. What can you do in a month or in 2 months to demonstrate that the software is delivering value? You also want to make sure that whatever vendor you pick is going to be right alongside you for the ride. So making sure that they have the expertise to not only train you on how to use the software, but to also train you on the best practices. So for example, what are other companies doing in your industry to really make this work? And lastly, and I can't stress it enough, is just making sure that your data is cleaned and organized and ready to go from day 1. If you think that after you import bad data that you're going to have time to clean it up, it's 100% going to steer you down the wrong path. So the data is important, your project team is important, making sure that there's a really strong training program is definitely kind of the 3 things that I would really take away from this conversation. So Anna, what do we have for questions today?
All right, so we have a couple questions here. Put your questions in the chat panel if you have any, and we'll get to those. But let's start with these couple first ones. So, I mean, what we've seen a lot with clients is that it is really hard to get people to actually use the software, and that is a main pain point of why the system eventually fails. So what's one way to motivate your staff to actually use the system?
Yeah, so one of our clients recently, this was actually a couple of weeks ago, was telling me that to motivate her engineers to actually use the system is she's having a contest. So who can close out the most work orders in a week? She quickly learned that they were putting work orders in for things that didn't necessarily need an individual work order. So now she's kind of defined it as who can complete the most work orders of corrective maintenance in a week. So the reason why that's been really motivating for them is that her team there is super competitive. So they really like to compete against each other. They want to see who can do the best. They get that come in every morning and look at the board and see who's in the lead or who's in 5th place, and they get really annoyed when it's somebody that they don't like. And she's motivating them by something super small. I think she's doing a $20 gift card to Dunkin' Donuts or something like that. So it doesn't have to be a huge prize, but I think making it fun and contests seems to be really helping our clients.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. We see that even here with our sales team. You know, a little bit of motivation goes a long way.
Everybody wants to be a winner.
Yeah, exactly. So you talked a little bit about power users and the train-the-trainer approach to get others on board, but how would you go about identifying who that power user is? And also, do you think it's best practice to kind of have a few power users in case someone leaves the company?
Yes, so you definitely want to have a couple of power users. So power users could be in different departments. So you may have one person who is in engineering who really understands how the engineering team is using the system, and they're the power user for that team. Then you may want to have somebody who is the true system admin. So the people who understand when somebody comes to you and say, hey, I really want to rejig this process, or hey, can you help me, do silly things like make the font bigger on my system. Those are all things that a real true system admin should do. So definitely multiple people. So I would think about it in terms of who is your system admin, and ideally there should be two, again, if one person leaves. And then who are kind of your power users per department. So especially in accounting, there's typically a power user. Anytime information about money is happening, there has to be somebody who really knows what they're doing. And then again, if engineering is using it and then a very different department is using it, making sure that each person has somebody represented within their department. We see that a lot when we work with healthcare organizations, that you're going to want somebody, if for example at one of our hospitals, there's somebody in facilities, but then there's also interior design who uses the system, but they use it in such a unique way, in such a limited capacity, that the facilities person is not the right person to teach the interior design team how to use the system.
Thanks, Courtney. We actually have a really good follow-on question for that. So what do you find most productive, bringing late adopters forward or focusing on the primary users and engaging early adopters before that?
So I think you kind of have to understand your organization for it. So what we often find for late adopters is you can define late adopters in two ways. So late adopters as in you rolled out a system 6 months ago and at month 7 you have people who still aren't using it. I think you can be a little bit more lenient with them and really work with them on how to move forward and how to get them to use the system. What we've found really helpful in that case is having a buddy system. So having somebody who really is using the system well, who is their peer, kind of walk them through how to use it. A lot of the times it is just that understanding of how to use it. There is a second bucket of late adopters that they may have had the system for 5 years and they're still just saying, nope, I'm not going to do it. I want to write everything down and I'm just not going to do it. And at that point, it does become, I think, a condition of employment. So one of our clients uses that phrase, that the aware manager is a condition of your employment. And when people don't use it, and that allows you to have an inability to track your data, to really understand what's going on in your operation, then it becomes a performance issue for that person. So then it's kind of more of the stick approach than the carrot approach.
Yeah, that's really great feedback, Courtney. So we're just running up on time. I'll get to one more question. And if you have any other questions, feel free to either reach out to Courtney or I will get them answered for you. Any ones we don't get to that you put in online, we'll get back to you on those too. So the last one, just to go back to your point about integrating different solutions. And over the past couple of years, we've definitely seen a shift in realizing that, sometimes it's better to use a different system for different business processes, which really means investing in open solutions. So how do you qualify what an open solution is? And are there really any specific things you need to look for when evaluating solutions providers for an open system?
So there are really kind of three letters to keep in mind. The name of the game in integrations are APIs. So those are things that software companies will build out to allow their software to talk to another software. So the easiest way to phrase it is, do you have an API? That's what I would ask of your provider, whoever it is. If they say no, that's probably, I would assume, a red flag for you. That's what I would view it as, just because if that doesn't exist and they have no plans to build it, that means it's going to be incredibly difficult to be able to connect that system to anything else moving forward. There are a lot of qualifiers about APIs. For example, does it allow you to read the information, or can you edit the information? Is it a one-way integration or a two-way integration? But those can all be kind of figured out a little bit further down the line, but the tier one question is, do you have an API?
All right, I think that's all we have time for right now.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Anna's going to send out the presentation, and I think we have a couple of other resources that we'll send out along with this that are also associated with the topic. But thanks for joining us today, and you'll probably hear from us within the next kind of day or so. So we'll call this Happy Friday Eve for now. Thanks, guys.